Okay, perfect. Sounds good. So thanks so much for the opportunity. And hi, everybody. My name is Abdul Kazi. Looking forward to presenting today. Today's topic is Cloud Adoption Framework Governance Overview. It's really a broad topic, so I wanted to pick governance as a piece, and we'll take a look and see what that entails. So before we jump into the presentation, let me do a quick introduction. So my name is Abdul Kazi. I've been in the IT industry for almost 20 years now. Been working with Azure since 2014, very active in the community. I'm a co-founder of a meetup, Come Cloud with Us. So anybody who is new to speaking or would like to speak, we're always looking for speakers. So, come hit me up. And then if you want to connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn, fairly active on LinkedIn and Twitter. And I have an active blog as well, so do check out my blog. I write about Azure. I've done quite a bit on the Azure Landing Zone, Cloud Adoption Framework, so those kind of things. And then, typical certifications from the MTC to, couple of certifications on the Azure side. I also have some AWS certification, but my main focus has been on the Azure public cloud. So before we get into governance, a lot of people are moving into the cloud. So there are people who are either thinking of moving to the cloud from on-prem environment, or the other option is going to be, a greenfield environment, right? They're born in the cloud. They don't have any presence right now. So typical your startups, they're mainly a greenfield environment. They don't have anything. They want to start up. They want to come into the cloud as a greenfield environment, and then, they want to start small. So that's really the beauty of the cloud. Cloud actually has evolved, and it has evolved even our thinking now, right? So I was talking to one of my customers, and they're like, okay, we want to set up a Kubernetes cluster on premises, and I'm like, why would you want to do that, right? Like, why do you not want to go to the public cloud? And after talking to them, it really made sense for them to move to the cloud, because think about the cloud, right? The cloud actually provides you agility. It provides you cutting edge innovation, meaning whatever you can do in the cloud, you cannot do it on-prem. Plus, the thing is, cloud is so secure. A couple of years ago, when I was working for a Microsoft reseller, I was talking to CIOs and CFOs, and like, why should I move to the cloud? How is cloud really secure? That was really the stigma of the cloud then. Now, everybody wants to move to the cloud because cloud is much more secure. So even from a Microsoft aspect, Microsoft actually spends $1 billion just alone in security every year, because that's pretty much their bread and butter now, right? So that you have to have a good strategy when you're moving to the cloud. When I'm actually doing, so I work for Microsoft partners, and then I've done Azure Landing Zone reviews. What that entails is, looking at the environment, current environment. People actually, when they move to Azure or the cloud, sometimes, they don't really have a good plan, and we'll talk about this, but you need to have a plan of why do you want to move to the cloud, right? And the challenges you are going to be facing when you move there. So I'll talk about the Microsoft Adoption Framework. Not sure if how many have you heard of the Microsoft Adoption Framework. This actually really came out of the Microsoft professional services. So Microsoft used this framework when they used to do professional services, or in fact, when they still do it, professional services for enterprise customers, and then they made it available. So if you look at the framework, right, there are three main facets: people, process, and technology. And really, what this does for you, right? The framework is a collection of documentation, technical guidance, best practices, and tools to provide you guidance for the cloud adoption. Because when you're moving to the cloud, right, it can be daunting. It's not, yeah, you're going to start going spinning up services in Azure. You have to really have a plan there, right? So from that aspect, you need to have the proper guidance. You have to have the right people. You have to have the right buy-in from the proper stakeholders. So that's why this is a great framework to follow. And since cloud is I would say, so cloud is not a destination, right? Do not think of cloud as a destination because cloud is iterative. Once you move to the cloud, it is going to be keep changing. You might have one workload today, but in maybe 18 months or 24 months or in a couple of years, you'll have more workloads. So it is a very iterative process. It keeps changing. And so hence your process is going to change. The technology is going to change. And that is going to produce more challenges and more work. So this framework still would be applicable if you are in the cloud or are you planning to move to the cloud. So with the cloud adoption framework for Azure, right, there are 6 facets to it. So the first one is going to be before you even start, you would be defining strategy. You were defining, so any time a business wants to take any new initiative, they have to prove to the business why should we do this, right? So the first question your CFO or finance people are going to be asking, okay, what's the ROI? What's the TCO for us to move to the cloud? So you have to do a business justification. So you are going to be defining that, right? So define strategy. That is going to be part of the strategy, saying, okay, this is the reason we want to move to the cloud. The second one is going to be plan. Okay, how do we want to move to the cloud, right? Like, what is the plan? What are the challenges? What do we need? Do we need skill set? And think about it. If you're coming from an enterprise customer, the skill set from an on-prem enterprise environment is going to be completely different than you're moving to the cloud. If you're on-prem, you might have different within IT, even if it's centralized, you might have different groups. So, and IT would be siloed. Coming into the cloud, the challenge is cloud is flat, meaning there are no silos. So you have to plan properly. You have to make sure that the people have the right skill set for the cloud when you adopt the cloud, right? So that has to be properly planned. What services are you going to be using? So Azure has so many services that you should not just go and start spinning up different services, right? There has to be a plan. There has to be governance, and that's where really governance comes in, because you would say, okay, we only are going to be allowed to spin up X amount of services just to make sure everything is working properly. And we'll see that in the next slides. And then moving along, the ready state would be you would start to set up your Azure as a greenfield environment, meaning there's nothing there, right? The first thing for ready is going to be setting up the Azure landing zone. And think of Azure landing zone as a foundation. So let's say if you're building a house or a bridge, right? You lay down the foundation. A strong foundation for the house is crucial. And that's exactly what Azure landing zone does for you. It's going to set up, your guardrails, your security. If you have compliance requirements, the compliances are going to be set up. Your identity management, your RBACs, those kind of things. So pretty much best practices. So that's going to be your ready state. So that's exactly, what you are going to be working on. The next step is going to be the adopt phase. Adopt has 2 phases, migrate or innovate. So when you talk about the migrate, you can, if you're moving from on-prem environment, into Azure, you probably can do a lift and shift. A lot of people just bring their environment as is, and they're like, yeah, right now we want to bring them in, and then we will, modernize them later on. And then later on they say, okay, we want to innovate, so they would be using the 7 Rs, right? Refactor, rehost, those kind of things to make sure that they're innovating their or they're modernizing their application to make sure it's up to par with the cloud, right? So you might have services that are running in IaaS, infrastructure as a service, and then you might say, okay, we need to containerize this. We need to run Kubernetes. We need to run microservices. So that is really the part where you innovate part of the cloud adoption framework. And then moving along would be govern, right? So, and one of the reasons I put govern is when I'm working with customers, govern is such a critical piece, but it is left behind because there's so many different stakeholders that are involved. So when you have governance, right, not only IT is going to be involved, you will have legal, you will have finance, you will have other people, depending on the organization, how big is the organization, how the structure looks like, right? And honestly, governance is not sexy. Like, you're not spinning up things, you're not deploying things. So sometimes that they're like, we'll leave this to policy. So that's why governance does not get really the attention it deserves. But on the flip side, if you are a highly regulated industry, such as a bank or public entity, then yeah, compliance would be requirements, and so governance would be top of mind. And then lastly, um, how do you manage the environment? So from a managed standpoint, right, day-to-day operation, how would that look like in the cloud? Because that's going to be very different compared to your on-prem environment. So these are the different phases, but today I'll focus on the governance piece, and then see what are the best practices and what should companies really be doing. And feel free to ask me questions, right? I want to keep it interactive. So if you have any questions, just come off mute and then ask any questions. So you might say, okay, what exactly is driving IT governance, right? So as I mentioned, if you are in a highly regulated industry such as banking, healthcare, you have to abide by a lot of laws. So if you're banking, you might comply with SOC 2. If you're a public company, Sarbanes-Oxley. If you're in healthcare, HIPAA. Education could be FERPA. In Canada, we have our own equivalent of HIPAA here that we have to abide by. So that's why you need IT governance, because the idea of governance is really to keep the risk low, but at the same time you have to modernize your environment and the growth has to be there as well, right? Because you would be getting audited on a yearly basis. You have to make sure that you're compliant. So governance is absolutely important. And in this age of day, like, security is becoming prevalent. So security and governance are going to play hand in hand to make sure all the environments are secure. The worst thing that can happen today to a company is getting compromised, ransomware, or they get hacked, and that's going to be a PR nightmare for a company, not only and plus financial, loss as well, because they're going to be losing a lot of customers. So that's why governance is really important now. And as I mentioned, governance from a model, it should really be, there has to be a balance for control, stability, and speed and result, right? So I'll use the example of shadow IT. I'm sure a lot of you folks know what shadow IT means. So, in the old ages when people used to connect to VPNs, they had to VPN, access the file server, get a file, and then work on it. What they would do is email that document to their personal email, and then they're like, yeah, I'm going to work after hours or whatnot. That kind of became shadow IT. So with governance, there has to be balance. You don't have to be very tight, but from a security aspect, giving the tools to everybody, because think about it, especially with COVID, right? People want to work from anywhere, any device, and whenever the flexibility provides. So IT now has to be very flexible, but we also have to take a look and see how the growth is going to be. Think about in the last 2 years, right? IT actually has grown or modernized rapidly. So the tools we provided now, like Microsoft Teams, Zoom, the other tools that we have, they have gone up tenfold, if not more, because the rate and the speed of growth is phenomenal. So there has to be a balance, and with that come challenges, because you have to also make sure that you're providing the right access, right tooling to the environment. So from an organization alignment, right, when you're moving to the cloud, you have to have a cloud governance team. What I've seen even in the enterprise space and mid-market enterprise customers, that there's not a focus on having a governance team specifically for the cloud. The on-prem team, or as a general role, things are being rolled under the regular team. One of the challenges that comes with that is the cloud adoption team wants to move fast, but then they get stuck because of compliance requirements, or things cannot move fast because the governance people don't know what the risks are going to be, because the challenges are going to be very different from, let's say, the on-prem environment or even a cloud environment. So a perfect example is if your company has a requirement to keep data locally, data sovereignty requirement, that is going to be a challenge. So you might have to pick a specific region. That actually comes under governance. Now you have to figure out, okay, where does the data reside? Can the data reside in the US region? Can we even move, for example, the region to Europe? Now, if you move to Europe, do we need to abide by GDPR or not? So those kind of things come into play. So there's a lot of things that have to be accounted for, and that's why governance has to be top of mind when you are moving to the cloud, because those things are going to impact for how you adopt the cloud and how you expand the cloud, right? So those challenges have to be, I would say, tackled head on, rather than you're being reactive on those. And that actually really slows you down, because from a governance standpoint, if you're not taking a look at that, then the challenge is going to be the project might go ahead, but because of governance, the execution might not happen. So you're pretty much at a stall because things were not properly accounted for. So now you may ask the question, okay, why exactly is governance important, right? So, and I kind of mentioned the transformation versus risk mitigation. So, and these are all fair questions to ask if you are moving to the cloud, or even if you are in the cloud, right? A lot of customers I talk to, sometimes they don't put enough emphasis on the responsibility. For example, what roles and responsibilities must be defined. They're like, people don't know. So I was talking to one of the customers, and from a security aspect, the security, Azure security was a little bit gray area. People did not know if this was under the Azure or cloud team, or was security sitting under the corporate security division. So you have to define that very well, because then the challenge is going to be who's taking care of that, and when audits happen, who's responsible, and from a security posture, who's going to be doing risk mitigation, who's going to be accountable, and then who can basically take a look and see, okay, this is what we are going to be doing from a strategic standpoint. So the other thing is, what organization changes are needed from a governance standpoint. So when you move to the cloud, is this going to be a new organization? Is it going to be a umbrella organization, or is it going to be a cloud? Is it going to be a separate division? So there are a lot of things you need to take a look and account for when you're moving to the cloud. The other thing is, when you're moving to Azure, you have to start small. So you have to think, okay, what services are we moving to Azure, right? And then how are those applications going to be impacted from a compliance standpoint, from a security aspect, from a risk aspect? So those are the questions that people should really be asking. So the first thing usually people do is they go through the Cloud Adoption Framework Governance Benchmark, and this is an amazing tool that Microsoft actually provides. And I can actually talk, like, this is a tool that I can talk about for a day or so, because sometimes the workshops are for a day on this one. So I'm not going to go into the tool as well. Feel free to look this up and go through the exercise. But yeah, this is a great tool. It actually provides you your current state, and then also provides you your future state, where you want to be, and it's going to ask you a bunch of questions. Based on that, it's going to basically give you a good benchmark what the future would look like. So now let's talk about the Cloud Adoption Framework governance model, right? When I talked about the 6 pillars, so governance was one of the pillars, and under governance, you have at least 5 disciplines. I'm not going to go through all the 5 disciplines, because even talking about one discipline actually is a session by itself. But I'm going to today just highlight some of the important ones that should be needed to get people started with the cloud. And even if you are in the cloud today, those should be the best practices that companies should be following. So the main 5 disciplines of cloud governance are cost management, security baseline, resource consistency, identity baseline, and then deployment acceleration. So cost actually is usually top of mind for people, because one of the biggest challenges I've seen with cloud is, cloud is consumption model. So think about when people buy equipment or any technology equipment for on-prem environment, right? They're basically buying it as a capital expenditure, and depending on your organization, you can depreciate that between 3, 5, 7 years, so you can even last it for 7 years. Now, with cloud, the model is consumption, right? It's just like a utility bill. The more you consume, the more the bill you will get. So that's why cost management is top of mind. You have to start monitoring your costs. You have to have budget limits. You can create accountability on the cost side of things. And then a lot of companies, what they also do an internal chargeback. So they say, okay, we'll charge you for this, and you are responsible for this line of business application, and this is going to be coming out of your budget. So that actually eases the entire process. So what does the governance framework look like from an Azure native tool aspect? I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's so many tools that you can do. So for example, from a cost management, you can do Azure Policy, you can do Azure Cost Management, Azure Advisor, those kind of things. The identity one, which I'll talk, you can do, Azure AD, B2B, B2C. You can even do federation now. So there's so many things you can do, and depending on the use case, right? Like obviously, one size doesn't fit all. So you have to take a look and see, okay, what is your business requirement? What is the need? And where do you want to go? even from deployment acceleration, right? You might even bring your on-prem environment or on-prem tools into Azure. I was talking to a customer like, we don't really want to use Azure Backup. We have our own third-party software that we want to leverage. The challenge is that's going to be, define your RPOs and RTOs. So you have to kind of think about, okay, how are things going to basically match in Azure, and is that going to meet your business risk and your compliancy? So those are things that you have to think before you start making decisions within your cloud environment. And then from a third-party integration, right, there are so many other third-party services that you can integrate. The one I would call out is the HashiCorp Terraform, because a lot of people actually are using that now. Obviously, you can use ARM templates, you can use biceps, but because a lot of companies are becoming multi-cloud now, that's what I've seen a lot of companies move in that direction. And people should be automating today. That's actually one of the other things from a governance standpoint. Things should be automated. So I was talking to another customer, and they had a fairly large MRR, in thousands of dollars, but they were still click mouse. They did not have a strategy of automation. They were not using any IAC, infrastructure as code. So those things also should be part of the governance, saying, okay, how's that going to look like from a governance standpoint? Because think about it, right? If you have that plan, if you have proper IAC, then everything is automated, right? And it's going to be easier not only to deploy, but also accountability is going to be easier. So those things, should be done properly. So that's actually a very important part of the governance piece. So when it comes to automation. And then from a business risk, right? Like when you're moving to the cloud, or even you might be in the cloud and you need to ask these questions, what are your compliance requirements? And I kind of mentioned before, depending on where you sit or where the company is, if you're North America, right, you might have to abide by SOC 2, HIPAA. If you're Europe, could be GDPR. So those compliance requirements would dictate what services are you running, how you run, and what other things you would have to do. So for example, if you let's say have to abide by SOC 2, you might say, okay, security is going to be top of mind. You need to make sure encryption is there, MFA is there, right? Those kind of, they're obviously going to be checkboxes, and every compliancy has different requirements. Or if you, let's say, have PCI compliance, from a credit card standpoint, that is going to have a different requirement now. So that moving into the cloud, or even or let's say if you're bringing a new workload, new application that has compliancy, that's going to basically open a lot of can of worms, if you will, from a compliance requirement. So you have to think about, okay, how's that going to look like, and what are the risks for those compliances and applications, right? The other thing is, how's data governance going to be handled? Because data governance is huge now. So think about it. We've actually producing more data now than we have ever produced. So even think from your personal aspect, right? Like we have email, we have social media, we have pictures, we have everything. So, and even companies are churning out data by the minute. So how are we classifying data? So you have to also classify data, because some data is going to be crucial, some data is going to be confidential, highly confidential, depending on your organization, because some data might have intellectual property that would be truly confidential. So think about CIA, right? CIA has highly confidential data, so their data governance is going to be totally different than a regular business, if you will. So you have to think about that aspect as well. How are those things going to be accounted for? And the other thing is, if there's any specific application that really requires governance, because if that application requires governance, then you have to work around that application to make sure that those requirements are fulfilled. And sometimes what I've seen is people bring in the application and then they think about the governance piece, kind of working backwards, and it causes a lot of challenges. So the next step I'll talk about is, what should a good governance look like? And then I'll talk about starting from the organizational level. So when you set up a new Azure environment, right, the first thing is going to be you're setting up your Azure tenant. So pretty much, you have a subscription. It's nothing is there. So first, you'll have a subscription. Ideally, what you want to do is, and Azure actually comes in hierarchies, right? So the top piece is your management group, then you have the subscription, resource groups, and resources. And then regardless of your subscription, right, where you're buying it from, could be CSP, could be pay-as-you-go, could be enterprise agreement, that doesn't matter. Once you have the subscription, you have to define, okay, how are things going to look like? One of the biggest challenges I've seen is when people move into Azure, they don't have a good strategy of naming convention, right? They might say, okay, region 1. Now you have another region coming in the same country, then now, is it going to be region 2? So I've seen a lot of challenges on that. So the naming convention has to be top of mind when you're moving into the environment. Sure, from a subscription aspect, you can change, rename the subscriptions and whatnot, but resource group and resources, that's hard to change. So start from when you move into the cloud, or even now, people they say, okay, I only have one workload in Azure now. And then after a year, they might say, wow, I have 10 workloads. And all the naming convention might look different because they did not actually have a proper naming convention, and it was not thought through. The other thing is tagging. People don't actually use tagging, which is very important because, and we'll talk about tagging in the next couple of slides, but yeah, tagging is very important, not only from the cost and chargeback, but then you can tag resources, and then it's easier to manage from that as well. So I kind of mentioned the different pieces, right? So the first piece is the management group. So the management group is really the higher hierarchy, if you will. You would have a root management group. Sure, you can change the name of that root management group if you're the owner, but that's the main management group. You can create sub-management groups underneath that, and then under the management group you would have a subscription, and then under subscriptions you have resource groups, and then under resource group you would have resources, right? So you have to think about this, because from a governance standpoint, if you do not set this up properly, it is going to be a hodgepodge. I've seen customers where they have 20 different subscriptions and 2 management groups. And then the challenge is, how do you apply RBAC to that without breaking anything, or apply Azure policies without breaking anything, because the structure is not properly defined. So what are the best practices from a management standpoint, right? So the management group really depends on the organization type. There are multiple ways. Obviously, as they said, there are multiple ways of skinning the cat. So it really depends on your organization, how big is the organization, how you want to align. A lot of people, in this example, as we can see, you have the corporate IT, then you have a production management group, you have development, and then QA. right? And then the subscriptions are divided underneath. So under production, you have the mission critical subscription, then the protected data, and then other production. And then under development, you have the non-production subscription, and then staging, right? And then ideally, what you also want to do, you want to have a shared management group where you would be running the shared services. So your firewall, your networking, all that should be part of that shared services. But this is really an exercise where people say, okay, what the organization is going to look like, and where do you want to go? And what I've also seen is people start small, and in a year or even 6 months, they completely change their management groups and subscriptions because they had brought in multiple new workloads into the organization. So what does governance MVP look like? And then the MVP is minimum viable product. So basically, where MVP is like where you could just start minimally. You can it's basically a start, and then you can start building on there. So if you look at this example, what this looks like from a management standpoint is it's dividing into geographical regions. So, a business group, one could be in North America, the other could be Europe, and then they're dividing between environments, so production and non-production. So as I said, it really depends on your organization, how the structure looks like for the organization. Some organizations actually divide their management groups based on line of business, because what happens is that they might have a line of business which is completely different. They'll run their own subscription, they'll run their own QA and testing, and they would be responsible for the cost and everything, right? So it really depends on if the IT is centralized or decentralized, and there are multiple factors you have to look. But generally speaking, you have to have some sort of management group hierarchy. When I'm doing Azure landing zone reviews for small customers, generally speaking, they do not have any management group, and that's one of the struggles that people have, because they think, oh, I have the subscription now, I have the resource group and resources, boom, that's it. But having management groups is important, because then you can have the hierarchy, and then you can assign policies. So as you can see on the side here, right, it trickles down. You can assign policies, because you do not want to have policy on the subscription level, because the challenge is if you have, as you can see here, right, you might have multiple subscriptions. You'll have to go and assign policies to each different subscription. That's going to be a pain to manage too. If you're applying policies on the management level, it is going to trickle down. So it's much easier to manage that way, rather than applying on the subscription level or even on the resource group level. So now let's talk about the subscriptions, right? How do you design your subscriptions? And that's actually another topic, because a lot of companies do it differently. You would have to think, okay, how is your company, what is the layout of the company, right? So I guess we have two examples here if you look. So the first one is the subscription group would be development subscription, lab subscription, QA subscription, and production. So they're basically splitting it out in that fashion. The other example is they're doing it based on line of business, right? So HR department, accounting, finance. So both are right. None of these are wrong, but obviously at the end of the day, you have to figure out, okay, what exactly are you trying to achieve, and how is that going to look like? Because up here, if you look, from an HR department, this is a subscription, right? So all that would be trickling down here, and you would have different kind of resources, different applications under the HR subscription, versus the accounting and finance. Finance obviously is going to be using different services than HR. So that really makes sense. Even on the development and QA side of things, you can have different subscriptions. What also I have seen, and obviously, in the enterprise space, is some customers have a totally different tenant for QA and test environment, and they're mirroring their production into that environment. Uh, Obviously, that's going to be a challenge to maintain because you have to maintain two environments, but that can be a possibility, right? Obviously, that's going to be for a large company, large environment, but for a smaller environment, even mid-size or smaller enterprises, you can have development, lab, QA subscription, and production. So that should work fairly nicely for people. And then from a subscription aspect, right? This is one of the questions I get asked quite a bit: is do I just need one subscription, or should I need multiple? I would say ideally you want to have multiple subscriptions because there are going to be limitations on subscriptions and what you can do on there. And depending on the hierarchy you're putting on, right? What exactly is the subscription going to be used for? Is it for production? Is it for QA? Is it for a different line of business? So those are the things that need to be asked. The other question is who's responsible for creating the subscription, right? Who would have access to the subscription? I've seen a lot of people just get assigned owner access to the subscription, which should not actually be the case. I do not, yeah, people should not be assigning anybody, owner access or even contributor access to any of the subscriptions because you're pretty much giving the keys to the kingdom. And we'll talk about RBAC and identity, in a couple of slides, but that is very critical. That should not be the case. So you have to think about, okay, how the subscriptions are going to look like, how can we break them down, and what are the limitations on the subscription side of things. And then these are, so one thing I want to call out is, the naming convention I kind of mentioned before. You have to have a good naming convention, and depending on the organization. So if you take a look at the example here, if you're basing it on the line of business, so you would have the company, you would have the department kind of line of business, you can have the product line and the environment, right? So that would be a good naming convention because that's really unique. And even if you have another line of business coming in, then you can follow the same criteria. And then also this naming convention can even be taken to other public clouds as well, right? Because keep in mind, companies are moving to multiple clouds. They want to be in multiple clouds now. So how do you replicate the same naming conventions, the same policies in the other cloud? Because why reinvent the wheel when you already have done your work? And again, it's also going to depend on separation of duties, right? As I said, test, dev versus production, or you can do it based on different line of businesses. You might even have a project coming up. You might say, oh, we have a project for 6 months that we need a complete new management group and subscription. And then based on that, once that project is done, that subscription can be archived. So there are different things that have to be considered when doing a subscription. So, these you have to go through the exercising, asking the right questions, and go from there. So now let's talk about RBAC. So RBAC, is very important when it comes to security from an identity standpoint, because what happens is you can assign a user, group, service principal, or managed identity. I generally speaking do not like assigning individual users because then it's a management nightmare. generally speaking, you should be assigning groups and service principals and even managed identities to your subscriptions or management groups, depending on what kind of role you want to assign. Ideally, you should be creating a custom role. The only caveat I would say with a custom role is custom roles do require the Azure AD Premium 1, P1 or P2, so that's going to be an extra license because the built-in roles sometimes are not enough, right, to assign. Obviously, you don't want to start assigning the owner contributor role because that's going to be too much access. So you want to start limiting from the built-in roles, but sometimes the built-in roles might not work, so you might want to use the custom role. But with the custom role, you'll have to use the Azure AD Premium licenses. The good thing about that is going to be, you can customize the role based on the need of the organization, because every organization has different needs. That there might be people wearing multiple hats in organizations, so that's why you really need a custom role in there. And then once you have that role, you can choose the scope. So as we see here, the scope, could be on a subscription, resource group, and whatnot. So that actually should be defined, and these roles should be actually checked every couple of months. What I've seen is companies assign these roles. Somebody leaves, their account is still valid. People can still access those services. So there has to be from a governance standpoint, a check and balance and to make sure that people, when they leave the organization, their access is taken off, their accounts are disabled, and or even within organizations, sometimes people change role, so they might not need access to those resources. Those access should be taken away, right? Because we should start with the zero access, minimum access, and whatever they need, that should actually go through the governance committee. So to justify why do they need access, what exactly is the need, and then go from there. So from a resource group aspect, you can do tagging and RBAC. So once you have the RBAC set up, you will be doing tagging, and tagging can be done basically. One of the biggest reasons people do tagging is for cost centers. They want to basically do a chargeback. So let's take a look at that. So here's a decision tree for your tagging. So this is one of the reasons you would do. You must say, okay, we have a project. So let's say a company has created a line of business, is doing a project, and they have created a line of business, subscription group, management group, whatnot. They want to keep track of that, but some of the resources are under another subscription, or they're using shared services in the infrastructure. So now they want to basically have those tags tagged in those subscriptions to make sure that the cost is coming up. So that's the decision tree. So basically, why are you tagging? What is going to be the business impact? What is the purpose? Who are the stakeholders? So those decisions have to be actually made. And tags have classifications, right? Like I talked about the data classifications as well. So that is also going to be defined in the tagging as well. Tagging also can be defined in a production environment, test environment, right? So those kind of things is a specific project that you're tagging and whatnot. So tagging is fairly important, I would say. And these are the context from a cost analysis, right? So you can do tagging, you can do finance codes, application context, deployment context, and who's accountable, right? So for example, who's the business owner? So let's say if you're doing a project, who's going to be the business owner for this? And then you can do tags, and then you can do chargebacks for that project. So if you have to charge a third-party entity, or let's say a supplier or a vendor or whatnot, you can, with tagging, you can build those costs in there as well. And then let's talk about policies. I've kind of mentioned policies, but why have policies, right? What I've seen is people do not have policies in place because they're like, oh, policy might be too intrusive in our environment. But policies really is, used to create and assign and manage policies to make sure that you're enforcing compliancy. And then also it enables auditing in the environment as well, right? So you are comparing with policies your properties of the resources to business rules, which are your policy definitions. You'll have the policy definitions, and then I would, and actually policies can be implemented as we saw previously on the management group level, subscription, resource group, and even individual resources. So that's actually the beauty of policies. But again, as I mentioned, policies should really be implemented higher up because then it trickles down, and you want to start policies on the management group or subscription group. Although you can do it on the resource group, but then the challenge is going to be if the resources change, you add more resources, then you'll have to add more policies. So it becomes more work for you. So operationally, you have to think, how are you going to manage all the policies as well? So from a policy standpoint, there's some use cases that you can use. So allowing only resource types that can be deployed. So when you come into Azure or any public cloud, right, it's open. The challenge I mentioned is because cloud is consumption based, anybody can go and spin up any services. The challenge is going to be when you get a bill after a month, you'll be like, wow, this really break our bank. So you want to basically get ahead of yourself, have policies where you say, okay, only allowed resources type can be deployed, limiting the SKU types for virtual machines, for example, right? That's going to help you. So nobody can go and start spinning up the high-end GPUs, VMs. That's going to obviously break the bank. And the other thing is you might have a compliance requirement that you are only allowed to spin up resources in this region. So you might say, okay, you're only allowed to spin up resources in North America. So anything else, you would not be allowed to. So that actually can be enforced with policies. And with policies, you can enforce tags as well, right? So let's say and technically what should happen is anytime you're spinning up a new resource, that resource should have a tag. So you should enforce a policy saying, okay, if the new resource does not has a tag, that resource cannot be provisioned. So because again, if you're doing chargeback and you have a resource that is not tagged, that is going to be a problem. So those kind of things, you can enable with policies. One of the things I recommend is you do with policies is you do audits. I do not recommend enforcing or denying policies because that's going to be a major challenge. That's going to break a lot of things. Because what people do, they go in there, they start enforcing policies, they start denying policies, and you run into a lot of issues. Turn on policies, but start auditing and seeing, okay, what are the issues you're having from a compliancy aspect, from other aspect, and then roll out the remediation in stages. Because if you start, you open the floodgates, that's going to be a nightmare for not only you, but the IT department. The help desk might get inundated by calls and saying, oh, this broke or this happened, or even the alerts might be coming off the wazoo. So you might be like, wow, so you have to be kind of careful in that piece. Take one step at a time, start with policy audits, and then enforcement, and then start denying. So, some things you can deny, like I said, the region, right? So if you, from a compliance standpoint, say, okay, you cannot have any resources provision in, let's say, anything except for North America, then that's a deny, and that's the easy one to deny, right? Because you know that that can happen, but other things might not happen. So you have to think from what you can deny and what the other things you can start enforcing from an audit standpoint. Now, from a cloud governance team, when you're setting up the team, you have to make sure that your team is really aligned from the strategic aspect, the cloud, they have a cloud plan, and then from an operational standpoint as well. What I've seen is people come into the cloud, they say, okay, yep, it's fine and dandy, everything is good, but they don't have a long-term strategy how the cloud is going to look like, because currently you might be in one state and then in 6 months it's going to be a complete different state with different requirements, different compliances and whatnot. So that actually that governance team has to take a look and see and make sure that all those compliances are accounted for. And that's why I said in the beginning, cloud is not a destination, right? It's an iterative process. It keeps evolving. You might have one workload now, and in the future you might have maybe 10, 15 or whatnot workloads. So just to give you a sense on the governance kind of things, the cost from a cost management, you can take a look and you can start tagging. You can see, okay, allowing VM SKUs, storage SKUs, networking, those kind of things you can allow, or you can start denying. So these are the things that you have to start from the beginning. These things have to be accounted for. I've seen companies where they say, okay, we are only going to be allowing X services to begin with because we have tested. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Abdul, nothing.
Okay. So, yeah, so I've seen customers, right? So from that aspect, they're like, we are going to be making sure that we only spin up things that are tested, because if you don't test things, then it might break. So that's why they would be allowing specific VMs, putting storage SKUs, networking SKUs from that aspect. So you have to account from a costing aspect. Security baseline, I've kind of mentioned that already, in a sense that from a data and asset, data classification, I cannot emphasize data classification is absolutely critical. From a networking standpoint, you have to think about networking. So the one example I see constantly is, when you're moving or coming into the cloud from on-prem environment, people would have, they're not accounting for proper subnets or proper IP addresses, or there might be an overlap between your on-prem and cloud environment, right? And that's not accounted for. So those kind of things have to be accounted for. The hybrid identity, now you have to think about, okay, VPN, is VPN going to be enough, or do I need a express route, and is that going to be, WAN, or what other things I have to account for? Encryption, what about encryption at rest and encryption in motion? Those kind of things have to be accounted for. So there has to be a security baseline policy that the governance team is going to dictate, regardless of what services you're using, or regardless of what line of business is going to be using the Azure services. Because depending on the company, some organizations are so siloed that one a line of business might have their completely different requirements, but obviously on the higher level, they have to abide by the security policies, right? So that's actually very important. From a resource consistency standpoint, I've kind of already talked about, the naming convention, the tagging, the allowing resources type and whatnot. So these are absolutely critical, because if you do not have this, this is going to be causing a lot of problem in the future. And keep in mind, this is an iterative process, so you have to keep coming back to this. And then again, from an RBAC standpoint, um, start small, start with zero, do no access, right? Unrestricted access to subscriptions. I still see people assigning owner access or contributor access. That should not be the case, because that's too much access for the people. As I said, customer roles would be ideal, but if you cannot, just use the built-in roles. For depending on the organization, sometimes that are more than sufficient for the environment. And then from a deployment aspect, right? Look at DevOps, look at automation. You should be start using automation, standardizing the environment, because even from an automation standpoint, it is the fastest mean, because you're going to be automating the environment. It's not ClickOps. A lot of companies are still using ClickOps, and they run into issues because they miss something, or that feature is not even in the portal, that is only done through the CLI. So you have to have another policy and a configuration to follow the best practices from that aspect. So let's talk about, and I know we're almost out of time, but quickly I'll run through the sample policies. So for the cost management piece, as I mentioned, allow Azure region for resources and resource groups. So these should be the ones that should be allowed. Only allow Azure SKU VMs that should be provisioned, because not everything should be provisioned, because then cost is going to be out of control. From a security baseline, you need to take a look at security and see, okay, what are the requirements? Do we need protection for data, encryption at rest, encryption at motion? When is a VPN required, right? What are the other things? Let's say from a security baseline, do you have web applications? Do you need a web application firewall, WAF, for that web application? So those are the security baseline that is going to be needed from that. Again, from resource consistency, your naming conventions, your data classifications, those kind of things are going to be crucial for the governance. And then some of things might actually come in the future. You might not think about them, or they might not even apply. And obviously, these are not exhaustive lists, right? Because sometimes these are basic things, but sometimes people might say, right now, today, I don't need a backup, but then maybe later on, you might need a backup. So it really depends on the use case and what you're trying to achieve. But these are still the basic guidelines that should be followed, right? From an identity baseline, I cannot emphasize multi-factor authentication. I still talk to people and they do not have multi-factor authentication enabled. Like, that's pretty much a no-no in this world now. Everybody should have should have multi-factor authentication enabled in their organizations, right? So again, that's another identity baseline where people should really be starting in their environment. And then from a deployment acceleration, this is a bit tricky, because everybody does deployment differently, different tools, how you're going to be deploying. So have a good policy and procedure for the cloud, and follow the best practices mainly for that one as well. You have to have something there, right, for the people to follow, because if you do not, then the challenge is going to be everybody's going to be doing their own thing, and there's not going to be a standard operation procedure. So you need to have really a standard operation procedure for deployment and patch management and whatnot. You might follow what you have on-prem or you were currently, that should be fine, but then it has to be tweaked to the cloud, because for example, backups. The backups in the cloud might be very different based on your RTOs and RPOs compared to your on-prem environment, right? So that gonna have to be tweaked around and seeing how that's gonna look like. With that being said, that's the last slide. So I'll take any questions if you guys have.
Thanks, Abdul.
Yeah, my pleasure. No, hopefully this was helpful.
Yeah, it was indeed. Thank you, Abdul. It was very good session. I hope everyone would have learned a lot today. If anyone would like to ask anything to Abdul, please feel free to unmute yourself. You can also post your question on the chat. I don't see anything as such on the chat. Scott is asking a link to the slide deck. Abdul, will you be able to share your slide deck?
Yeah, that's not a problem. So what I'll do is I'll post it on my blog. So if you go to my blog on the speaker section and under this session, I'll put these slides up there. So hopefully by end of tomorrow or something, we can have that.
Perfect. All right. With that, thank you, Abdul, for taking time tonight to present on Cloud Adoption Framework. Thank you, Improving, for sponsoring tonight's meeting.